I didn't realize this trip would feel different until I saw him waiting by the truck that morning, leaning against the hood like he had all the time in the world. It had been years since I'd gone hunting with Mark, years since I'd even been back to this stretch of pine forest where the air smells like cold earth and cedar. I used to tag along with my best friend, Evan, when we were kids, but Evan was in Chicago now, buried in grad school. This trip wasn't with him, it was with his dad. I told myself it was just for the nostalgia, a way to get out of the city for a weekend. But seeing Mark again, broad-shouldered in his old flannel, the kind of weathered hands that looked like they could fix anything, pulled something taut inside me I didn't want to examine too closely. "You're late," he said, but there was a smirk tucked in the corner of his mouth. "I'm not late. You're early." I tossed my bag into the bed of the truck, careful not to meet his eyes too long. The last time I saw him, it was at Evan's graduation party. He'd clapped me on the shoulder and told me I should come visit sometime, that the woods hadn't changed. I didn't think he meant it, not really. But here I was, climbing into the passenger seat, trying to act like this was just a weekend of hunting and not whatever it might become. The drive out was quiet at first, except for the steady hum of the tires on the cracked road and the occasional whiff of his aftershave, subtle, clean, a little piney like the forest itself. My mind wandered to the little things I remembered about him. How he never rushed his words, how he could make a fire with one match, how his laugh came low and easy. When we finally turned off onto the gravel road, the trees closed in on both sides, swallowing the light. I felt that same mix of excitement and nervous energy I'd felt as a kid, only now it was sharper, tinged with something I couldn't name without admitting too much. I told myself it was just the woods making me feel this way. But when he glanced over at me with that half smile and said, "Got a spot I want to show you?" I had the strange sense that whatever happened out here, I wouldn't come back the same. Mark's cabin was exactly how I remembered it, half hidden by the slope of the hill, its wood siding faded to a soft gray, smoke curling from the chimney like it had been waiting for us all week. We unloaded the truck in companionable silence, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty. It struck me how natural it was to be around him even after all these years. "You still take your coffee black?" he asked, setting his thermos on the porch rail. "Yeah. Same as you." He gave a little nod like he'd just confirmed something important, and we headed inside. The warmth hit me instantly, along with the scent of wood smoke and cedar. I let my bag drop near the couch while he busied himself with the gear. We'd known each other since I was 13. Back then he was just Evan's dad, cool in a low-key way, the kind of guy who'd let us skip rocks at the lake instead of pushing us to fish if we didn't feel like it. He had a knack for making you feel capable without ever making a speech about it. Our friendship, if that's what you could call it, grew in small ways. He taught me how to track deer prints in the snow, how to tell the difference between coyote and fox scat. There were late summer nights when Evan would go to bed early, and Mark and I would stay by the fire, trading stories and listening to the woods creak and shift. I hadn't realized until recently how much those nights had meant to me. Now years later, being here again felt both familiar and unsettling. Every glance from him seemed to carry a weight I couldn't quite decipher. After we'd stowed the rifles and unpacked the food, he frowned at the pile of bedding. "Damn. Thought I had 2 sleeping bags in here." I raised an eyebrow. So, unless you want to sleep under a tarp, we're doubling up." I pretended to groan, but my heart thudded harder than it should have. "Fine. But you're not stealing all the blankets." He smirked. "We'll see." It was a small complication, but it lodged itself in the back of my mind for the rest of the afternoon. The image of us sharing the narrow cot in the back room kept flashing up at inopportune moments, bringing a heat to my face I hoped he didn't notice. We headed out before the sun dipped too low, rifles slung over our shoulders. The snow was shallow but crusted, crunching under our boots. We didn't say much, but when we did, the conversation flowed easy, jokes about Evan's terrible aim, old memories of trips past, the occasional teasing jab. "You still walk too loud," he murmured at one point, eyes scanning the treeline. I shot him a look. "Maybe the deer just like me more." He chuckled, and for a second his gaze lingered on me in a way that made my stomach tighten. As the light faded, we turned back toward the cabin. Halfway there, a cold wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of oncoming snow. By the time we reached the porch, flakes were swirling thick in the air. "Looks like we're in for a night of it," Mark said, stomping the snow from his boots. I glanced out at the white curtain closing in around the cabin. We wouldn't be going anywhere until morning. That meant hours inside in close quarters and, thanks to the missing sleeping bag, sharing more space than I'd prepared myself for. It should have felt ordinary. But the way his hand brushed mine as he passed me in the narrow entryway, the quick flicker of his eyes meeting mine before he looked away, It all felt like something else entirely. The storm came in faster than either of us expected. By the time night fell, the wind was rattling the cabin's shutters and snow piled halfway up the porch rail. The fire in the stone hearth crackled hard, but the draft still found its way in, cold fingers slipping under my clothes. Mark tossed another log onto the flames. "Won't be much hunting tomorrow if this keeps up." I sank deeper into the couch, cradling my mug of coffee. "So what, we just sit here and wait it out?" He shrugged, settling into the armchair across from me. "Could be worse ways to spend the night." His eyes caught mine for a beat too long, like he'd just realized what he'd said. Then he looked away, rubbing the back of his neck. The room felt smaller than it had that afternoon. Maybe it was the snow muffling the world outside, maybe it was the way the firelight softened everything. I was hyper-aware of him. The creak of the chair when he shifted, the way his fingers curled around his mug, the faint scent of his aftershave warming in the heat. After dinner, a simple stew we'd thrown together from canned goods, he rummaged through a closet for extra blankets. I found one more, but it's still not enough for 2 separate beds. I tried for nonchalance. "Guess we're doubling up then." His grin was slow, deliberate. "Guess so." The cot in the back room was narrow, just wide enough for 2 if neither of us moved much. We set it up with the remaining sleeping bag unzipped into a blanket and the other spread over it for padding. I kept telling myself it was just practical. Warmth, comfort, nothing more. But when we finally lay down, me on my back, him on his side facing the wall, I could feel the heat radiating from him. His shoulder brushed mine every time he shifted, and once when he rolled slightly closer, the weight of his arm grazed mine. I stared at the dark ceiling, listening to the wind outside and the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. My chest was tight, not with fear exactly, but with a gnawing awareness of every inch between us, and every inch not between us. "Still awake?" he murmured. His voice was low, almost swallowed by the storm. "Yeah. You always did have trouble sleeping the first night out here." I smiled faintly in the dark. "You remember that?" "Of course I do." He shifted again, this time his leg brushing mine under the covers. It was a fleeting contact, but enough to send a pulse of heat through me that had nothing to do with the fire. I told myself not to read into it. He was probably just trying to get comfortable. But then he spoke again, softer this time. "Cold?" "A little." Without hesitation, he pulled the blankets tighter around us, his arm brushing across my chest in the process. The gesture was casual, friendly even, but the weight of it pressed against something I'd been holding back for years. I wanted to turn toward him, to close that last bit of space and let everything I'd been feeling spill out. But what would that change? Evan was his son. I didn't even know what I was, not to him. The storm roared louder outside, rattling the windows. Mark let out a long breath, the kind that sounds almost like a sigh. "This reminds me of that night in '09 when the power went out. You and Evan were terrified we'd freeze." I chuckled. "You built a fire so big we were sweating." "Yeah. And you stayed up with me after Evan fell asleep, playing cards by lantern light." His voice had gone softer, more thoughtful. In the dark, with no one else around, it felt like a confession in its own way, not of love but of something remembered and kept. I closed my eyes, trying to calm the thud of my heartbeat. "Guess some things don't change." "Some things don't need to," he said. I couldn't tell if he meant me. The wind outside screamed against the cabin, but in here, the world had narrowed to the sound of his breathing, the faint warmth of his body, and the sharp ache of wanting something I wasn't sure I could have. Eventually, I felt his arm settle loosely over my waist as if in sleep. I didn't move. I couldn't. I just lay there, staring into the dark, letting the weight of him, anchor me in a way nothing else ever had. I must have drifted in and out of sleep because the next thing I knew, the fire in the other room had burned low, and the only light was the faint blue glow seeping in from the snow outside. The wind had quieted, but in here, his breathing was still the loudest thing. Mark's arm was still over my waist. Light. Careless. Like it had just happened that way. Except now I wasn't sure I believed it was unintentional. I shifted slightly and his fingers flexed just enough for me to notice. "You awake?" I whispered. Pause. Then, yeah. The air between us felt charged, like the moment before a thunderclap. I could have rolled away, said goodnight, let the tension dissolve into the safe ambiguity we'd lived in all day. But something in his voice, quiet, steady, maybe even expectant, pulled me in instead. "I've been thinking," I said, my voice catching halfway through. "That sounds dangerous," he murmured, and I could hear the faint smile in it. But then he went still, waiting. I swallowed. "You ever remember something from years ago and realize it meant more than you understood at the time?" His breath slowed. Yeah. I know what you mean. My heart pounded so hard I was sure he could feel it against his arm. Like that night by the fire after the power went out. We stayed up and played cards and you talked to me like I wasn't just some kid tagging along. Like I mattered. You did matter, he said simply. You still do. The words hit me harder than I expected. I turned toward him in the dark. I could just make out the shape of his face, strong jaw, the faint curve of his mouth, eyes catching that ghost light from the snow. I think I've wanted to tell you something for a long time, I said. My throat felt tight. But I didn't because I didn't want to make it weird. For you. For Evan. For me. Mark didn't move but his gaze locked on mine. Tell me anyway. Every instinct told me to back off, to laugh it off, to protect whatever this was by not naming it. But his voice, low, steady, unflinching, felt like an open door I'd been circling for years. I like you, I said finally. The words sounded too small for the weight they carried. Not just as, Evan's dad. Or some guy who taught me to track deer. I've liked you for a long time. And I can't be out here with you like this and pretend I don't. The silence stretched. The only sound was the slow rush of my own breathing in my ears. Then Mark shifted onto his back, his arms still brushing mine. I knew, he said. It took me a second to process it. You, what? I figured it out a while ago, he said, voice quiet but certain. I just didn't know if it was something you'd ever want to say out loud. And you didn't care? His lips twitched. Care? Of course I cared. I just didn't want to push. You've got your own life. You're younger. And there's Evan. I didn't want to risk making you feel cornered. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. So you've been, what, just waiting for me to say something? Waiting to see if it was more than a passing thing, he said. His eyes softened. Guess I have my answer. Something loosened in my chest, a knot I'd carried so long I'd forgotten it was there. It's not passing, I said. It's never been passing. We lay there in the dim, the warmth between us almost tangible now. He reached up slowly like he was giving me every chance to pull away, and brushed his knuckles along my jaw. The touch was so light I almost thought I imagined it, but it lit every nerve in me like a struck match. You sure? He asked. Because once I cross this line, I'm not pretending it's just hunting trips anymore. I nodded, not trusting my voice. His hand slid to the back of my neck, steady and warm, and then his mouth was on mine, soft at first, almost tentative as if testing whether this was real. I kissed him back, my hand finding his shoulder, feeling the solid weight of him under my fingers. It wasn't the desperate kind of kiss you see in movies. It was slower, deeper, years of held-back words and sidelong glances unfolding into something undeniable. When we finally pulled back, our foreheads rested together. His thumb traced a line over my cheekbone. Been wanting to do that longer than I should admit. I smiled, breathless. Guess we're both guilty then. He chuckled, low and warm, and in that moment the storm outside felt like it belonged to some other world entirely. In here, it was just us, finally saying the things we'd both been circling for years and not turning away. For a long time we didn't say anything. The wind outside had calmed to a muted hush, the kind you get after heavy snow, and the quiet in the room felt deeper somehow, less like we were holding something back, more like we'd finally put it down. Mark's arm stayed around me, his thumb absently tracing slow circles against my side. It wasn't a nervous gesture, just grounding, like he was making sure I was still there. You're quiet, he said after a while. I smirked faintly. I'm trying not to say something stupid. Try harder, he teased, and I could hear the smile in his voice. I turned toward him, propping my head on my hand. So what now? We just act like this was inevitable? He met my gaze, serious now. No. We act like it's real. Because it is. But we take it slow. Figure out what it means when we're not snowed in a cabin 100 miles from anyone. There was a steadiness in his voice that I'd always admired, the same tone he used when teaching me something important. It made the thought of going back to the real world feel less like a crash and more like a plan. Evan, I said quietly. Yeah. His fingers tightened slightly on my side. That's gonna be a conversation. Not tonight, but soon. I exhaled, tension creeping back in for a moment. You think he'll hate me for this? Mark shook his head. I think he'll be surprised. But I don't think he'll hate you. Or me. And if I'm wrong, well, we deal with that when it comes. His confidence settled something in me, enough that I could smile again. You're a lot calmer about this than I expected. I've had time to think about it, he said, a glint of humor in his eyes. Besides, I've been in worse situations. Once wrestled a raccoon out of a bait cooler. I laughed, the sound loosening my chest. I'm not sure that's the same thing. Depends on how you look at it, he said, brushing a stray bit of hair from my forehead. The touch was so casual, so familiar, it felt like something we'd been doing for years. We lay back down, this time without the careful inch of space between us. His arm was firm across my chest now, his leg brushing mine under the blankets. I let myself lean into it, letting my hand rest on his forearm. This is weird, I said softly. Good weird? I smiled against the pillow. Yeah, the best kind. We stayed like that, talking in low voices, about nothing and everything. The storm. The first deer I'd ever tracked with him. The time Evan convinced us to camp in the yard and ended up sleeping inside after an hour. Every memory we touched seemed to take on a new color now, the kind you can't see until you know what you're looking for. At one point he shifted closer, his nose brushing my temple. You know, sharing a sleeping bag has its advantages, he murmured. Oh. I asked, pretending to play along. Warmer. More efficient. Easier to keep track of you if you wander off. Ah. Just purely practical reasons then? He grinned, and in the faint light I could see the boyish curve of it. Absolutely. I'm nothing if not practical. I kissed him again, slower this time, not rushing it. And when we pulled apart, the look in his eyes made the cabin, the storm, even the years we'd spent avoiding this, all of it, feel worth it. Tomorrow, he said quietly, we'll figure out the rest. But tonight we just stay here. Here, I echoed, and for the first time in years I felt exactly where I was supposed to be. By morning the storm had broken. Sunlight poured in through the frost-laced window, catching in the drifts outside so that the whole world looked dipped in gold. The air was still sharp with cold, but the silence was the kind that felt like a clean slate. Mark was already up, stoking the fire in his flannel and jeans, moving with that easy economy that came from years of knowing exactly what needed doing. Coffee's on, he said when he noticed me stirring. I pulled on my sweater and joined him by the fire, hands wrapped around the steaming mug he passed me. Our fingers brushed in the exchange, and this time neither of us looked away. The morning felt different, lighter, like we'd both stopped carrying something heavy in secret. Still, the practical part of my brain tried to push in, asking the big questions. What happens when we leave? What do we tell Evan? What if this changes everything? But before any of that, Mark leaned against the mantel and said, "You're thinking too hard." Am I? I asked. Yeah. You've got that look like you're trying to solve a problem that hasn't happened yet. I huffed out a laugh. Guilty. He crossed the room and sat beside me on the couch. Close enough that our knees touched. Here's the thing. We've got time. We don't have to map out the next 10 years this morning. All we have to do is decide if this, he gestured between us, is worth taking home with us. I stared at him for a moment, the fire popping softly in the background. It is, I said finally. For me it is. His eyes softened, and for a moment I thought he might kiss me again, but instead he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small brass compass, the kind with a cracked glass face and worn edges. Found this in my tackle box yesterday, he said. You used to borrow it when you were a kid. Couldn't find your way to the outhouse without it. I laughed, taking it from him. That was one time. Two, he corrected, grinning. Then more quietly, keep it. For when you're not here, so you know how to get back. The weight of it in my palm felt like more than just metal. It was a promise. We packed up after breakfast, loading the truck under a pale winter sky. The roads would be passable now, and the world beyond the woods would start pulling us back into its noise and pace. But something had shifted in us, and I knew I wasn't leaving that behind. As we climbed into the cab, Mark started the engine, the old truck rumbling to life. For a moment we just sat there, the breath from our mouths clouding the windshield. Then, without saying a word, he reached over and took my hand, resting it on the seat between us. Not hidden. Not hurried. Just there. I glanced at him and he gave me the faintest smile. We'll figure it out. And somehow I believed him. As we drove down the gravel road, the forest falling away on either side, I slipped the compass into my pocket and felt its reassuring weight. The needle wavered for a moment before settling north, steady and sure. I didn't know exactly where we were going, or what waited for us when we got there. But with him I knew I wasn't lost. Not anymore.